sola bandera y hagamos un universo.
Hagamos un universo con una sola bandera, con una sola bandera. Hagamos un universo.
Que vengan las primaveras con claveles y violetas, con claveles y violetas, y que caigan las fronteras, más unidos que nunca, con dignidad. Ayudemos al hermano en solidaridad, más unidos que nunca, en un latido se levanta entero el mundo unido.
Welcome. I'm John Fanestil, and on behalf of the entire team here at VIA International and the VIA Cafe, we welcome you. Thanks for joining us. This is the first in a new series that we're calling Las Noticias from the Border, or News desde la Frontera. And I want to just share a little bit about this series and what I'm thinking about, and so looking forward to sharing over the next couple of weeks with you all before I introduce our guests for today. As some of you know, I had the chance to spend a couple of years in a program of history at the University of Southern California. And among the characters who most stood out to me, who has really haunted me ever since, is a man named Francisco Ramirez, Francisco P. Ramirez. Francisco Ramirez was born in 1831 in what was then Mexican California, and he grew up in Los Angeles. He grew up across the street from a man named Jean Vigne, who was a Frenchman, and who was, in fact, a resident of Los Angeles and a printmaker, a publisher. Francisco Ramirez, therefore, grew up learning Spanish and English and French, and also being tutored in the art of printmaking, of newspaper work. He spent a couple of years in Northern California as a teenager and came back to Los Angeles when he was 17. And by that time, he was incredibly accomplished. He had worked in Northern California in newspaper work as well. And so when he returned to Los Angeles, this was just after the end of the US-Mexico War, he took what had been the fourth page of the English language newspaper in Los Angeles. For years, Los Angeles had had an English language newspaper called The Star of Los Angeles. And page 4 was always in Spanish, and it was titled La Estrella de Los Angeles. Francisco Ramirez took that fourth page and set out on his own, and from 1855 to 1859, published his own newspaper called El Clamor Público, the public clamor or the public outcry. And the transformation of Francisco Ramirez across these years is something I'll look forward to telling you more about on another occasion. But suffice it to say that he started out with great hopes for the future of California within the context of the United States. And then over those years and beyond into the 1860s and 1870s was disappointed again and again and again by the promises that had come with statehood and how the United States had failed to live up to its ideals in their treatment of the Californio people. The reason I am so fascinated by him, though, is not just for his work as a publisher and not just for his fierce fight for the ideals of justice and liberty, but also because he was a man who struggled with his own identity. And we've been talking a lot in our Via Voices series about the identities of the peoples of the borderlands. When I say he struggled with them, I simply want to say he was a man of his times, and his identity, he embraced different understandings, self-understandings as he passed through time. He was a Californio. He aspired to be an estadounidense, though was again disappointed again and again, and abandoned that entirely. Eventually, he ended up exiled in Ensenada and lived out the rest of his days there. But his strongest identity, and the one that stuck with him throughout his life, was one that we no longer even talk about. He really considered himself what he called an abajeño. And abajeños were people who rooted themselves in the southern part of the state of California after the US-Mexico War. They distinguished themselves from arribeños, who were what today we would call Northern Californians. So the battle for the capital of the state, for instance, after the US occupied California and took it into the Union as a state, big question was whether the capital would be Monterrey or Los Angeles. Francisco P. Ramirez, of course, wanted it to be Los Angeles, and he embraced this identity as a abajeño. They also called themselves arribeños, abajeños and sureños, to distinguish themselves from the arribeños in the north. So this question of identity, Francisco P. Ramirez just sticks with me because he, I think, was so distinctly a person of these San Diego-Tijuana borderlands, the Southern California borderlands. He had family on both sides, traveled frequently back and forth, was rooted in Los Angeles, but had a vision of California as a place that would live up to the high-minded ideals, not just of the American Revolution, but of the French Revolution as well. So Francisco P. Ramirez is kind of the patron saint, I'm going to call him, of this series, which we're calling Las Noticias from the Border, the news desde la frontera. And I almost wanted to call it El Clamor Público in his honor, the public outcry. As I hope that across this series, what we'll get to hear is voices from the borderlands, two of whom you'll hear today, and that we'll get to immerse ourselves more and more strongly in these borderlands and in the cultures and peoples that give it shape, and that we will learn, what the news looks like from the perspective of the border. As we all know, those of us who live around here, you can read the headlines from Washington, D.C., or you can read the headlines from Mexico City, and neither of them capture very well the realities on the ground here along the US-Mexico border. So welcome once more to Las Noticias from the Border. Welcome to News desde la Frontera. And I'm very pleased today to have two friends as part of our conversation. And I'm going to introduce them to you one at a time by having a little bit of extended conversation with each, and then I'll put them together and ask that we share some time. So I'm going to first introduce you to Christian Ramirez, and I think I saw him come in. Christian, are you there?
Hi, John. I am here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Christian, can you hear me?
Yes, I could hear you. Can you hear me, John? John, can you hear me?
We're not hearing you just yet, Christian.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
I could hear you.
I can't hear you, though.
Oh, no. Let me see
if we can get your audio going.
I can hear him, John, so he's coming in to some of us.
I can hear him as well.
I can hear it too.
So can I.
Yeah, we can hear him,
I
John.
see your microphone, Christian, but I'm not hearing you.
I don't think John
can.
can.
Christian, is anybody hearing Christian?
Are you hearing any of us, John?
Others are hearing, but not me. Okay. There you are. Bienvenido, Christian.
Gracias, John. Can you hear me now?
I can. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
My pleasure. I'm on a new computer, so I'm learning my new my new toggles, and I had my volume off. My apologies. Welcome, Christian. I have to tell you that one of the reasons that I wanted you to be on the first show is that, and I think you may remember when I first discovered Francisco Ramirez a few years ago, I called you up and I asked, "Are you related to this guy?" And I think the answer at that time was no, that you weren't aware of any relation to Francisco Ramirez. Is that right? Or do you know?
No. I actually, thanks for reminding me of that. I actually looked into it, and no, there's no relation, but there is a whole lot of similarities in the history of that important icon in our region's history, and my own family, who have called the borderlands home for the past 5 generations. So I did a little bit of digging, and none of my family members were actually born on this side of the border, and most of them were born immediately south of the current border between Mexico and the United States.
Yeah, well, someday I'm going to track down the tail end of his story. He eventually sought exile and lived out the end of his days in Ensenada, which he seems a man who really had visions for the future of California, and those visions were never realized.
That's right, and I think with this important Zoom space now that we're using Zoom, I think we are honoring his legacy. And thank you for that, John, and for this amazing team that we have on this call.
Cristian, I wanted to start really by asking you, ¿qué hay de nuevo? You know, what are you working on? What's fresh and current for you? I've seen some of your social media work around La Mesa de Esperanza y Justicia, but tell us a little bit about that, or what else are you working on these days?
Well, John, currently I am working for a labor union for SEIU USWW, which we represent 45,000 workers throughout the state of California, and mainly in the janitorial, airport, and security industries. And the work that we do there is to empower mainly workers of color who have been for a very long time impacted by the poor paying jobs and poor working conditions in those industries. But I am, at the end of the day, still very much a fronterizo, a borderlander, and I live in the community of Sherman Heights, which is part of the historic Barrio District here in the city of San Diego. And sadly, it is a community that has been impacted tremendously by the pandemic, not only in terms of COVID-19 positive cases, but also of the ensuing economic crisis. And as a result of that, we opened up a small little project that has taken a life of its own. And it's basically a mutual aid table, which was something that was very common here in the region also in the 1920s and 1930s, the mutualistas, as they were known, or the mutual aid helpers, which opened up these sort of community pantries, and that's exactly what we have going on here. And it's been a blessing to see how this project has taken off, but it's also a crude reminder of the desperate need that our communities find themselves in during this tremendous crisis.
You know, Cristian, I just learned a few weeks ago the word despensa, and because the work of Via International, as you may be aware, our sister organization in Baja, Los Niños de Baja California, is in fact involved in despensas in a number of different neighborhoods of Tijuana. And so was this something that you were familiar with? Did you, in your own family or childhood, I know despensa is also just a pantry in a kitchen, as well as a community source of support. Were you familiar with these despensas and the mutualismo, that whole philosophy, long before this pandemic hit?
I was, and we went through a similar process. I was born in Tijuana, and the early 1980s to the mid 1980s, Mexico went through a tremendous economic upheaval. It was a worst economic crisis it had seen, and these mutual aid. And I remember I was a young boy, but I do remember standing with my parents, my grandmothers, in what would be described in the United States as soup kitchens or bread lines. That was something that was very, very common in places like Tijuana during the economic crisis of the 1980s, that really created the mass exodus of Mexican migrants into the United States during the 80s and early 90s. So this was something that I had seen in the past, and here I just remember reading from history books, my own personal lived experience, that this is something that was needed, and it really took a life of its own. Folks began to share with the community the little that they had, and they took as much as they needed from the table. And now I'm proud to say that there are these tables of hope, as we're calling them, mesas de esperanza y justicia. There's several of them that have now popped up throughout the county of San Diego, here in Sherman Heights, and a couple of others in San Isidro and Imperial Beach. So this is part of the legacy of the border landscape of folks helping each other, and that's, I think, what's very intriguing about our region, that we always find a way of helping each other through a crisis, and this is no exception.
I've been so impressed. It's been such fun to follow on Facebook, Cristian, as it seems that you've been surprised at times by the volume. I think it was last week a shipment of tomatoes.
Yeah, it's we have, this is just a side little project. We I've been working from home, and decided to share just a few things that I was growing in the backyard, and And sometimes we have, a handful of cans of beans and jalapenos and whatnot. But this past Saturday, we had 65,000 pounds of tomatoes that arrived in a semi truck. And, it's one of those things that, if I would have planned this, and I'm an organizer, I know how to plan these things, but it would have been almost impossible to plan something like this. And the fact that it came together so quickly, that we had a Teamster truck donated to us, a semi truck that went and picked up this produce free of charge. The tomatoes were then donated free of charge. And the tomatoes actually came from San Quintin, which is in the central part of the peninsula. And a distributor said, these tomatoes just, got ripe very quickly, and they're not going to go to market. They're going to spoil, and they're going to the trash. So somebody called me up and said, "Can you use some tomatoes?" I said, "Yeah, I could use a few." And they said, "Well, it's actually more like 65,000 pounds." Like, I don't know how I'm going to do that. And the stars aligned. We had the Teamsters pick up the tomatoes. We had iron workers help unload the tomatoes, and then we had, the señoras here from the barrio, organize the distribution. And in a matter of 48 hours, several tons of tomatoes were distributed to families across San Diego, most of them living here in the historic Barrio District. So it was a festive atmosphere, and in the midst of a pandemic, and it was wonderful to see communities coming together and and trying to figure out how to unload a semi truck that came through one of the streets here in Sherman Heights. So, but it was a beautiful sight to see.
Well, before we close today, I want to return to one of your posts about the Mesa de Justicia Esperanza. But I want to turn now and just introduce our other guest for today, Griselda Rosas. Griselda works between Tijuana and San Diego, and especially her work explores themes of cultural hybridity and explorations of identities. And I wanted to include her today also because of this recurring theme in these conversations of the identities of the borderland, which is so much a part of her work. So Griselda, welcome to you. And Griselda, nice to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. Nice to see all of you.
Yeah, and Griselda, tell us ¿qué hay de nuevo? What are you working on in this time of pandemic?
¿Qué hay de nuevo? Well, I do still cross the border with a mask and glasses, and I have a little boy, but I do still go and buy my materials across the border, and I have my sister across the border. So I'm still a trans-border artist, and currently I am at an exhibit at Bread and Salt, which is a San Diego Art Prize. The San Diego Art Prize normally selects artists either from both sides, Bajeños, from Baja California, or from San Diego area. So I always consider myself from both sides of the border. Although for Americans, if they hear an accent, they immediately think I'm just Mexican, but I am just Mexican, but I've been crossing the border all my life. So I'm used to these systems.
And the material that you work on is your most recent project, the one I'm most familiar with, is stitch work. Is that right? Stitchery? Mm-hmm. And tell us about that project.
I live for a few years. I've been going back and forth in Oaxaca, and then going to this big fabric store in Tijuana called La Parisina. So I buy a lot of stitching work. So I've been doing embroidery over paper. Instead of doing it on textiles, I do it over paper. And I normally commute, buy materials on both sides, and I try to fuse this relationship of the border with very religious iconography or watercolor paints, but they all deal with decolonizing the border in a way.
And does the Stitching Cuarentena, I see you titled a collection, is that a concept? Is Cuarentena something that you had grappled with before in your artwork, or was this a new theme that you brought your experience and methods to an entirely new content?
Well, all the quarantine work is done through the quarantine after COVID. Yeah. But also cuarentena means after a woman gives birth, is you give a cuarentena. I don't know in English if they do call it the same way. But
Not
in
exactly.
Spanish, it's called cuarentena. So you stay 40 days with your baby after birth. So I stay with my son. He's not a baby. He's 6, but we've been working together in doing watercolors, and I do stitching work over. So it's this motherhood relationship through the quarantine.
And I'm just going to share an image from your work, if I can find it. And perhaps you tell us a little bit about this piece in particular.
This piece, this is watercolor stitching work. So I do a little embroidery over paper, and I also use very religious iconography that Mexicans normally will have in their house if they're raised. Most Mexicans are raised Catholic, so they will be familiar with La Virgen de los Lagos, and I use it kind of to commemorate motherhood. So I've been using all these virgins over paper, and I go over on a sewing machine. And like I say, I always buy my materials on both sides, or I fuse both of them.
And tell us how old your son is.
6.
I think you and Christian will find some common ground in this regard. He is he in school at home?
Yes, he doesn't like it.
I hear your pain, Griselda. My son's also 6.
Yeah, Christian is he at home as well?
He is home as well, and students are great, teachers are wonderful, but it's the parents, I must say, that get on the students' nerves because they keep interrupting the teacher. My son doesn't like that at all, so he got really frustrated this morning because of that.
And remind me your son's name, Christian.
His name is Diego.
And yours, Griselda?
Fernando.
Fernando. And do you know each other, Christian and Griselda?
I've seen Griselda's work, but I don't think we've ever met.
I saw your talk at Bread and Salt when you brought when you spoke about the Love Fellowship.
That's right.
When you spoke, John, when you attend these.
Yeah, we had the Loeb Fellows were here at Bread and Salt with our friend, the architect Jim Brown, to talk about Friendship Park, which is a great passion of mine, and that both of you are familiar with, I know so much. Well, that's so fun, and so someday maybe the little boys will get to play together. I have a small grandchild, and it's one of the great pains of this time of quarantine is that the children are not able to play together. I take my little granddaughter occasionally to the playground or to the beach, and we have to keep her away from other children, which just is maddening. But well, tell me about this. I'm interested to learn a little bit more about how each of you think about the resources, los recursos culturales, estoy hablando, that the borderlands people are bringing to this pandemic. Griselda, do you find yourself, I know you have mentioned in your work that cuarentena has an element of isolation to it, but have you also found yourself connecting to other artists, and how are you sustaining community through this time?
That's a very interesting question. You know what? Because we've been talking about finding a community instead of making individual work like normally artists work by themselves, and not so much socially engaged, but finding a community that we can share a space, even if it's a virtual space. But then I think everybody's changing their mind of being individual to being a community. And I think that's what the pandemic is bringing. Like, we need each other to survive.
And Christian,
so I'm hearing the wall.
Yeah.
And I think the border will be a more difficult place to cross.
Yeah.
But it's also bringing Zoom meetings is bringing new things.
Yeah, the hardening of the border continues. Of course, this is decades and decades of hardening the border, but these new technologies do have their ways of connecting people across. Christian, how about the workers? You mentioned, of course, your work with SEIU. How are your workers in your union responding? Many of them, I'm guessing, would be essential workers. Is that right?
About 80% of our members are essential workers, John. That's correct.
And how do you see them responding, they and their families, through this time?
Well, it's been extremely difficult and challenging. For various reasons. Unfortunately, many of our members have tested positive for COVID-19. Several of our members have died as a result of this terrible disease. And many of our members live in the communities that are most impacted by COVID-19. 75% of our members are people of color. And San Diego is unique. You know, we are a statewide union in California. We have virtually members in every single urban center in the state. But San Diego, because of our proximity to the border and our uniqueness in being the borderlands, has a special dynamic for our members. About 300 of our members live in Tijuana and are trans-border workers. They commute across the border every day, and they are, you know, impacted by the irresponsible policies that we've seen, almost capricious policies that we've seen from the federal administration recently. You know, it's just the disastrous situation that occurred a couple of weekends ago, in which folks were stuck in the borderline for 10 up to 12 hours, and dealing with lack of social distancing at the queues, coming across, you know, being exposed to customs agents who don't wear face masks and those sorts of things. So, you know, we're dealing with policies up and down the state, but the policies impacting our members here in San Diego are unique, and there's just really no way of, there's no space for advocacy for trans-border workers. And it's an issue that is not new. We know that, you know, tens of thousands of commuters come across the ports of entry every single day. But now with this pandemic, it's just aggravated the reality of trans-border workers in a way that we haven't seen before. So it's been, it has been very challenging for our members, and it's something that we're trying to address, you know. But again, it's the border is always a place of complexities, and it doesn't allow us to really create that space for advocacy on that particular issue.
I have seen the stories about these 8-10-hour waits in the borderline to cross, including that some people were even just parking at the front of the line or as close as they could get, and then sleeping in their cars overnight simply to be back at the start of the queue the next morning. Kind of, you know, that early borderline always has a kind of a race to the bottom mentality where you try to get earlier and earlier to beat the rush. But that was an extreme case. And was there ever any explanation about what it was that caused that? Or it was almost an entire week, if I'm not mistaken, Crisan, that the lines were excessive to that extreme degree.
It has ebbed and flow. We had seen these delays in the initial stages of the pandemic, particularly when these policies were implemented by Mexico and the United States to only allow essential travelers to cross. A couple of weekends ago, with really no explanation and no anticipation, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, in essence, said that they were strengthening their policies around essential crossings, and it seems that unilaterally, not only here in the San Diego-Tijuana border region, but across the entire southern border, CBP pulled back their customs agents from the ports of entry and closed most access to or limited access to the ports of entry, causing massive delays. That, you know, it's been a long time since I've seen before, but it must be stated that, you know, this is nothing new. The Trump administration created these field exercises, as they call, which in essence shut down ports of entry for sometimes hours at a time, sometimes minutes at a time, using military-style training exercises, deploying bang grenades and smoke grenades and shutting down ports of entry, causing delays to our members. This was before the pandemic. And the alleged reason behind that at those moments was the caravans that were coming of migrants that were arriving from Central America and other parts of the continent to our region. But this is the sort of impact that these capricious policies of the federal administration, not just with the Trump administration, but even before in other administrations, has caused for trans-border workers, and we're still dealing with the consequences to such a degree that many of our members are now staying in San Diego. They're, you know, booking motel rooms and staying here during the work week and going down there for their weekend. Obviously, everything's coming out of their pockets, and that's another layer of you know, of the stress that essential workers face in the border region.
Yeah, I want to come back to the question of the Trump administration's use of the border during campaign season, right? Campaign style politics but let me ask you, Griselda, how you're crossing. You've mentioned that you've continued to go to Tijuana in search of the materials that you use, for instance. Have you found, how have you done that? Have you been picking and choosing your spots, or do you go at particular times? Do you stay with family and friends, or how is your cross-border life unfolding during this time of pandemic?
Well, my mother, she passed away, but her house still there, so it's vacant. So when I go, I stay in her house, but it's been robbed twice, of course, because it's an empty space. So I've been trying to see if I can get some of the immigrants in there, but I don't know the policies. I don't know how to share the house in a safe place, like
Yes.
without. Yeah. So I go there and stay in the house, and her house is in a really sketchy community. So
yeah, and so then you're able to.
I think things are more dangerous now.
Yeah, and then you're able to pick and choose your timing to come back and forth. Do you have a favorite time to cross back into the United States? A favorite time of day?
I have this entry. I am in the privileged side.
Yeah, understood. Understood.
It's privilege.
Yeah. Well, and tell me, Griselda, you mentioned the crime in Tijuana and that your mother's house has been robbed. Do you feel a sense of a difference there now in these last few months in Tijuana? I know the same stresses that play out in the United States with the pandemic, of course, are playing out in Tijuana. But I've heard one statistic that 40% of Tijuana residents are living really day to day, meaning that they simply can't quarantine. Leaving the house is not an option, or not leaving the house is not an option if you don't have food. But tell me, what's your experience of Tijuana over these last few months?
Well, I see things, they haven't changed much. But people they have to go to work. They can't stay home. The quarantine concept is a privileged concept, really. Yeah. It doesn't. But also they have safety rules, like they don't allow kids to go in stores. So I went to the store with my son and I didn't know. So he waited outside and I was mortified. Kids don't go in stores. So there's really a lot of restrictions about the pandemic, like how you conduct physically your space is interesting. I think they have good measurements.
Yeah.
But I think it's still the same. I don't think it's more dangerous or less, maybe a little bit more, but it's still the same.
Yeah. And I mentioned earlier the Via International with our partners, Los Niños de Baja California, are organizing despensas in a number of the colonias of Tijuana. I'm interested to know for either of you, has your diet, how are you eating, each of you? Are you staying healthy, and where are you getting your food, and how's that? Has the quarantine changed the way you go about your nutrition and daily life?
I've been fermenting because I've had so much work, so much food, and then it started going bad. So I fermented. I learned how to ferment food. And sometimes when I go to Tijuana, I bring my cans and things. Or if I get free food, I bring it home. I take it to Tijuana, to my neighbor.
Yeah, and Cristiana,
my diet hasn't changed. I just gained weight.
Dicen los 14 de la cuarentena. I've heard it all.
I think I'm on that same boat, Griselda. I think we put in a few pounds. It's an interesting question, John. I would say that, I live in a community that's considered a food desert by the federal administration, meaning that our closest grocery store is more than a mile away. So you have to walk or drive to a grocery store in this community to be able to get fresh produce and things that are healthy. So that had been a problem in the past. But it's an interesting question because it's been a true blessing to have to be a host of this table. Because what has happened is that and I also learned a new concept, gleaning, which is, I guess, a biblical concept that comes from, I think, the Old Testament, in which the wealthy farmers in biblical times would give the corners of their fields to the poor, the widows and the orphans, and the widows and the orphans will go into the fields and harvest the corners of these fields. And this is a concept, or gleaning is the term that I learned when I put up this table. And what has been a blessing is that now a lot of organic growers who for a long time were not able to sell their produce at farmers markets and things like that. And because of the pandemic, their business model was really up, in a sort of upheaval. They began donating produce to us, and we have a steady supply of fresh produce to our table that comes in, every other day, and now I'm fortunate enough to eat fresh produce that comes to my table, and I put a little bit extra. I have a little bit of backyard back, in the back of our house, and I grow a few things back then. But I think my health has ironically, my healthy intake of food has ironically improved, because now the stuff is literally in my front table, and it's amazing to see, in this community that's mainly made up of immigrants from Mexico. Many of them who came from agricultural areas in Mexico, who are now beginning to grow their own, their own vegetables, and we're seeing that model. So in some ways, that's been the silver lining of this pandemic, as workers are those that are not essential, they're not able to work. Many of immigrants did not qualify for federal or state subsidies or relief efforts, and now we're beginning to see folks really coming back, growing their food and exchanging it. So I've been very blessed that I have access to fresh produce, organically grown, locally grown in our community, which is extremely expensive, as folks know. If you want to do that and buy it, it's not economically accessible. The fact that it's coming to us is a true blessing.
Cristian, I know that you have to get going soon, but before you leave, I do want to ask you just a quick take on, I've been a little surprised that the border hasn't figured more prominently in the Trump campaign rhetoric as of yet, as of course in 2016 he practically branded his campaign with build that wall. It seems like he's found another nemesis this time with the Black Lives Matter movement and the violence in urban cities. But how are you feeling about the next 60 days, and what's your sense of campaign season as it unfolds here in the borderlands? Do you have some optimism in the midst of all of the chaos that comes down from Washington?
I am optimistic, John. In fact, the reason I have to leave a little bit early today is because we're starting a phone banking system for our members. We'll have our janitors, security officers, airport workers calling our neighbors in Arizona starting today to ensure that folks in Arizona begin to vote and turn to the polls. And we have seen a tremendous demographic growth of Latinos and African Americans in Arizona, partly because of the high cost of housing in California. A lot of folks are migrating now east. And we remain hopeful that as folks like Joe Arpaio, who was the sheriff of Maricopa County, the largest county in Arizona, was defeated in the polls. He tried to run again. He was defeated again. There have been a number of progressive champions that have been elected in Arizona. So there is an effervescence of electoral work happening in Arizona. We want to really ride that wave and defeat Trump in Arizona. So it's going to be challenging, no doubt. This administration has made it very clear that they're going to do everything they can to put as many obstacles in the way of people of color going to the polls, whether by defunding the United States Postal Service or by making it more and more difficult for folks to cast their ballots. But we're going to do our best. And our members have a track record of flipping Orange County. They did that 2 years ago. Every single member of Congress in Orange County who was an anti-immigrant and was defeated. They went to Arizona and defeated the anti-immigrant, the far-right candidates in Nevada 4 years ago. And I remain hopeful that the work that our members, in combination with the work that folks are going to be doing in Arizona, will flip the state of Arizona, and hopefully Donald Trump will see a defeat in Arizona, and that will block him from reoccupying the White House in November.
And then, of course, the work will continue under
absolutely
advocacy under Democratic administrations.
No, by no means. I think our work will not be over come November. And I've said this many times, John, as you know. I always say that our communities, despite of all the madness that we have seen from this administration, our communities have suffered more under Democratic administrations along the borders than under Republican administrations. And just because we will hopefully defeat Donald Trump doesn't mean that our work is over. Our work will continue to ensure that our communities are treated with dignity and respect here in the borderlands.
Yeah, Christian, thanks so much for joining us. I do want to, I'll maybe try to, don't know if you have one more minute. Do you have,
Sure.
do you have your hands on that Facebook post that you shared about your neighbor, the woman who came to visit you one night?
Ah, yes. I don't have it in front of me, but I have it, this is,
Tell us about that encounter.
this is my neighbor. She lives about 4 buildings down from where I live here in Sherman Heights. And she had been coming by our table every day. She is from a small rural town in the state of Guerrero in the central coast of Mexico on the Pacific coast. Older woman who obviously was in need of support. It was one of these very hot nights that we don't have, central air in our house. It was extremely hot in here. So I went to the front porch of our home where our table is located in the night just to get a little bit of fresh air. And she was like walking in, and she was a little spooked that I was there. She didn't expect to see me there, but she brought, a bag of flour, a liter of cooking oil, a few apples, a few pears, and placed them on the table. I said, no, and I said, Señora, you don't need to leave those. And she said, no, I want to leave those. And I said, no, you don't need to. Like, look, she said, look, I've been eating from this table. I want others to also eat from here. So please accept this. And now, I see her coming, and I know she wants to sneak in because she doesn't want anybody to see her. But she comes in almost every other night and drops off the little that she has. And I think that is the biggest lesson that I've learned from this pandemic, that a community that has been to fend for itself with no support from the federal government. To the contrary, there's been Border Patrol raids around here, ICE raids, a community that's not used to asking for a handout is helping each other out. And I don't pretend that this table, this is going to address the food insecurities of an entire community, but at least I hope that this model will help inspire others to know that the best solution is in our hands, and that if we come together and be creative and create spaces of mutual support and mutual aid, that we will be able to get through this crisis in a much more just way, and perhaps pave the way for a better society, and build on these examples of solidarity, so that when we get back to normal, if that day ever comes, we don't return to the normalcy of exclusion and oppression, but we build a new normal of solidarity and justice and hope.
Christian, I found your Facebook post. You closed it by saying, yo no sé cómo será el otro mundo, el que es posible, pero imagino que será así, donde amar al prójimo es tan común como una noche de verano. And I thought that was lovely. So appreciated it, and so appreciate your work. And really thank you for taking time to join us today. Gracias y hasta la próxima. Huh?
Thank you very much. Hasta luego.
Okay. Griselda, just as we finish up, I do want to check in with you too. You mentioned your Catholic upbringing, and I know also that you've been experiencing this time as a time of spiritual searching and spiritual devotion. Tell us a little bit about your inner journey during this time of quarantine. How have you experienced your spiritual life during these times?
That's a very complicated question. I don't know. I just pray, and I feel unity, and I don't look for religion anymore. I pray. I look for concepts and for things that probably can make cohesive our society and our love for each other.
And I noticed that in one of your works, for instance, you took a very Catholic iconography, but also included an image of the Buddha. And so that you are, do you think of yourself as would you identify todavía as católica? Si alguien te pregunta, ¿eres católica?
No, no, I don't trust the Catholic Church, but I grew up with it. So it's in the back of my mind. It's like embedded.
Yes.
It's the iconography that I'm driven to, and then I'm trying to dissect in my work.
Yes. And through your work, you're seeing connections between that cultural heritage, both religious and then also, but you seem to connect it to to a wide range of sources of inspiration. Where do you find yourself drawn? How do you, is it work? Do you feel like your work is mostly interior, or are you a explorer looking to the outside world, or is it both?
It's both, but I do a lot of research, a lot of historical research on the iconography.
Yeah.
Mostly, but I think it's both. It's my recognition of like the icons and how much they contribute to the way we are, even the borders, so how they exist between religion and the physical space, the spiritual and the physical space.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Griselda, thank you to you also for joining us today. I so appreciate it. And
Thank you so much.
yeah, it's a pleasure. And I'm going to share to our network. I think it's just griseldarosas.com, if I'm right, where I learned and got to learn more about your work, and so enjoyed browsing. I hope others will too. But we certainly appreciate you being here with us today. So thank you.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego. Friends, I'm going to just close by asking you to be sure to check in at viacafe.org. You can visit the Via Cafe anytime. Of course, it's open 24/7 on the web. But during the mornings, weekday mornings, our friend Robert Vivar is hosting the Via Cafe. And if you'd like to stop in during those hours, you can chat with Robert and learn more about the programs that we're offering there. I'll lift up, especially today, the Escuela Amistad, the Spanish language classes that we offer. Beginning, intermediate, and advanced classes are scheduled to start September 21st. So if you'd like to learn more about those, please do check out viacafe.org. Our guests next week are Professor Guadalupe Correa, formerly of University of Texas, Brownsville, and a longtime student of violence in the borderlands. And also Paul Espinosa, the filmmaker who will be familiar to many of you for his most recent work on the film documentary about the life of Chunky Sanchez. So next week, Tuesday, 12 noon, join us here. If you'd like the link to join, you can sign up at viacafe.org, or if you want to be on the list just to receive that invitation every week, just send us an email at cafe@viainternational.org. Thanks so much for joining me again. Welcome one more time to Las Noticias from the Border and News desde la Frontera, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks, everybody. Hasta luego.